on the legal profession, and I want to start by thanking you all for being here for a really highly distinguished panel on a highly important issue for our profession. And special thanks to Eilene Zimmerman for her path-breaking work in drawing attention to the problem of wellness or their lack thereof within the bar. Eileen has been a journalist for 3 decades, covering business, technology, and social issues for a wide array of national magazines and newspapers. She's a columnist for the New York Times Sunday Business section for 6 years. She's now pursuing a master's degree in social work. Her new book, Smack, A Story of White-Collar Ambition, Addiction, and Tragedy, is centered around the discovery that her ex-husband, Peter, a successful law firm partner, died from complications related to drug abuse. Her first writing on the subject, a front-page article in the Sunday New York Times business section, sent shockwaves throughout the bar and throughout the legal education community as well. It's of course no secret that many highly successful lawyers suffer from such problems. Lawyers have among the highest rates of stress-related dysfunctions of any occupation. But what the article brought home is just how serious and tragic their difficulties may be when others look the other way or fail to look at all. The problem was not just that Peter's escalating health problems were obvious enough for colleagues to spot. It was also their response after his tragic death. And the passage that was for me most shocking in the article and the book was Eileen's description of his memorial service. While a young associate from his firm delivered a eulogy, Eileen recalls that quite a few of the lawyers attending the service were bent over their phones, reading and tapping out emails. Their friend and colleague was dead. They couldn't stop working long enough to listen to what was being said about him. That description speaks volumes about our profession's need to pay more attention to addiction, not just to drugs and alcohol, but to work and electronic devices that contribute to the problem in the first instance. Eileen's article and the program we did at Stanford 2 years ago in its wake, when she came along with Patrick Crow, one of the nation's leading experts in stress and substance abuse, led me to think that we needed to do much more programming and teaching and writing around these issues. And we're so grateful to Eileen for making time on her book tour to come down to Stanford to help all of us strategize with Patrick about initiatives that will help prevent such tragic deaths. She's going to talk for about 10 to 15 minutes, followed by Patrick, who I will then introduce, and then we'll have a couple of questions and throw it open to questions from all of you. After the session, there'll be time for listening. So that's the plan, and we'll get it.
So I thought I would just introduce myself and tell you why I wrote the book, which is, as some of you may have seen walking in, is at a table outside. So in 2015, my ex-husband, Peter, and we were very close still, we were raising our kids together. He had been acting really, really strange for about a year, maybe a little bit more, but especially in the previous 5 months before he died. And the excuses he always used were related to work, and he was relatively senior partner at Wilson Sonsini, which many of you know is a Silicon Valley-based firm. He was in San Diego. He was working a lot of hours. He was tired all the time, but his behavior had become increasingly bizarre. He wasn't showing up for things. He stopped pretty much seeing his son. My daughter was at college. And he was very sick. He was very sick with this flu that kept getting worse and worse. He was losing his hair. His skin was kind of a yellowish gray. He had sores on his hands and his face, all kinds of things that didn't make sense. I later found out that he was getting medical supplies delivered to the firm through the mailroom into his office, like tourniquets and alcohol wipes and things like that. And the way big law is, a lot of people just thought, well, that's strange, but I'm not going to get involved. Maybe they knew more, but certainly the firm's line is they didn't. So there was a period of about 2 days where we could not reach him. His kids, me, his friends, I called his secretary. Nobody could reach him, and he had been very sick when my kids had last seen him. So I decided I was going to go up to his house and take him to the hospital and figure out what was wrong with him. And as some of you may know from the New York Times article or from my book, I showed up and he had died. And at the time, everything in the room was, you know, it was a drug-filled room. It had syringes and cocaine and tourniquets and bloody tissues and all kinds of medical supplies, alcohol wipes, scar cream, needle caps. I saw none of it because in my shock, I saw only Peter's body, and I didn't notice any of the track marks or anything else, and he was almost naked. He just had underwear on and socks. And it wasn't until the medical examiner came to the house that this medical examiner was able to tell me, no, looks like he died of an overdose. And at the time, I thought, impossible. He went to Cornell, he was #1 in his law school class, he was editor of the Law Review. You know, this guy is rich, he's, you know, not going to, he wouldn't be shooting drugs into his arms. And she said, actually, we see a lot of this now. High power executives, men and women, but I think to a greater extent men, who were dying of overdoses in San Diego County. And the journalist in me thought, well, there's a story there, but I can't pursue that now. And so I went through the process of probate and my own anger and greed. And I wrote about it for the New York Times, and what I learned was that there is a lot of substance use in the legal profession. We all know about the alcoholic lawyer, and my friend and co-presenter today, Patrick Krill, was one of the lead investigators of an ADA Hazelden Betty Ford study about substance use in the profession, which found that high evidence of substance use, of alcoholism. But a lot of the lawyers skipped entirely over the questions about drug use because even on an anonymous survey, they were not going to risk answering the questions. And so I wound up on this long road investigating what was going on. And after I wrote about it for the Times, I sold a memoir about what happened to Peter and what was going on in law and in other high power, high money, high prestige, white collar professions. And I learned a lot about you know, lawyers under a lot of chronic stress, short on time, feeling they can never disconnect, feeling very depressed and anxious, and an understanding that things are starting to change, but they will need to change even more. And I'm hoping that the next generation of lawyers will help push that change by not accepting some of the things that have been in place, you know, for generations and generations in the profession. I will end by just reading something I posted in order to do my research for this. Lawyers are not going to talk on the record about their drug use or their alcohol use. So I posted on 2 forums. One was Hacker News, which is a huge forum for technologists, but also people in finance, medicine, the hard sciences, and technology about their drug use. And 10 hours after I posted my query, I had 600 responses. And then I had many people writing me that they wouldn't answer me, even anonymously, until I got an encrypted email where they could email. And then I posted a query on toplawschools.com, which many of you may know. A lot of practicing lawyers are also on that forum. And I got about 70 responses. And one of the responses is not in the book, but was from a guy named John, who's in his 30s. He lives in the southeast US. He works at a small firm. And he said before he was a lawyer, when he was in law school, after he got out, he didn't take any medication. Now he's on an antidepressant. His wife is also a lawyer. She's on an antidepressant and Adderall. And he says the things that make his life hardest are that technology doesn't allow him any time away. He told me, you're expected to produce more work in the same amount of time than lawyers generations ago. No more research in the law library. Now you do it online. Communicating constantly, all hours. That has made it much worse. It's easier to just work all the time. And he also mentioned that older lawyers in his firms, boomers, especially older boomers who were at or nearing retirement age, would often talk to him and regale him with stories of the old days where they had older partners mentoring them, people that would take them under their wings, have lunch with them, talk to them not only about the law, but about how to manage their lives in such a stressful profession. And he said now there was no time for that. He did not have anybody mentoring him. He only had partners yelling at him. And he felt that was a really big disadvantage to this generation of younger lawyers, that because of technology, these older lawyers that were more experienced and had all this institutional knowledge, that time was not billable, so they could not spend it with the younger attorneys. And I just want to read, and he echoed something that a lot of people that answered me for the book, a lot of people in white-collar professions in technology and law and medicine said, and there's a neuroscientist, Peter Sterling, who has a forthcoming book called What is Health? And he wrote recently that the human reward circuit, which is traversed by dopamine, which makes us feel good, evolved to reward ingenuity, the mastery of tasks needed for survival and cooperation. But Sterling wrote, we evolved to explore the planet, but now multitudes are confined to punch a ticket, scan an item, or sit in cubicles in offices and stare at screens. Such activities, learned in minutes or days, present neither challenge nor surprise, so they are unrewarded. And without those small rewards, he wrote, we grow uncomfortable and seek relief. Now, certainly being a lawyer requires a lot of preparation, not minutes. But if you're sitting in an office, even if it has a view, even if it's in the corner, doing a lot of the same intense work, 10, 12, 15 hours a day, you will likely seek relief too. And so I think we are here today to address that growing problem. And I thank you all for coming.
Patrick Krill is a lawyer, mental health professional who is recognized globally as a leading authority on addiction and well-being in the legal profession. His groundbreaking work includes serving as the lead author of the first national study on the prevalence of attorney addiction and mental health problems, which created the framework for the American Bar Association's Well-Being Campaign, which he helped to craft. He's also the former director of the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation's Legal Professions Program, a preeminent clinical treatment program for addicted attorneys, judges, and law students. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Deborah, for the introduction, to be here. Thank you, Eileen. It's great to see you again and to be co-presenting. And thank you all for being here today. It's nice to see a full room and to be having what I think is a very important discussion for us as a profession. So you heard from Eileen not only her personal story, but also some of the research that she has done and some of the work that she's been sort of exploring over the course of her time writing her memoir. I want to talk to you for probably about 10 minutes about providing some context. I want to help you understand why it is that the legal profession is focused on mental health and well-being and addiction in 2020 and arguably for the last 5 years in a way that we have not historically been, and that's actually been part of the problem, that we haven't been very focused on these issues. And then I'm also going to explore some of the things that are currently happening within the profession, because we are making progress. Eileen mentioned that quickly in her remarks, that we are beginning to make some progress. There are some things happening in the profession at the law school level, also at the law firm level, and the overall profession-wide level that hold signs of promise. And there's the case to be made that we are really on the precipice of meaningful cultural change. So why is the legal profession talking about mental health and well-being? Well, you could reframe the question and say, why haven't we been talking about it when these challenges, high rates of addiction, high rates of depression, high rates of anxiety, high rates of suicide, have been plaguing the profession for a long time? It has been, in many people's view, the elephant in the room, but it has unfortunately not been something that we really wanted to grapple with in an open and meaningful and candid way. What has prompted a change, what has prompted a change in that discussion, and really led us to where we are now, where we are acknowledging the challenges that we face, the scope and the dimension of the challenges we face, and working to really chart a different future for ourselves, is data. On the one hand, that really did open the door to this conversation. Eileen mentioned that I had the opportunity to lead a large-scale research project. It was a survey of American lawyers published in 2016 in the Journal of Addiction Medicine. It was a collaborative research project between the American Bar Association and the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation, and what we found was that attorneys in the U.S. have significantly higher rates of problematic alcohol use, depression, anxiety, suicide, etc. They also have a lower level of willingness to seek help when needed. That is primarily out of fear of how it might impact them professionally, Overwhelmingly, the lawyers who participated in our study, 15,000 across 19 states, said that they would not acknowledge that they were struggling because they would be afraid it wouldn't be confidential, or that they would be afraid that others would find out they were seeking help, which really speaks to the stigma that is pervasive and persistent around mental health and substance use in the legal profession. It does happen to be the younger generation of attorneys who are at the highest level of risks, specifically those in the first 10 years of practice. That's the cohort that is at the highest risk. That's not to suggest that older, more experienced attorneys are out of the woods. Obviously, you heard Eileen's story, and Peter was a partner in a law firm and had been practicing for many years. And certainly these tragedies can occur to lawyers at any age, but it is really relevant, I think, for this group or here at Stanford Law School, for those in the audience and those who may be watching this to recognize that younger attorneys are at the highest level of risk. And then finally, there was also a study published in 2016 on the law student population specifically, which demonstrated similar themes, specifically elevated levels of distress and a lower level of willingness to acknowledge the problem or seek help for it. These studies, published in 2016, really built upon prior, more limited data from earlier decades and really sort of filled out the composite picture to help us understand that the challenges that we face are indeed significant and substantial. When this study was published, it really did get a lot of attention. And there was a lot of circulation of the findings, there was a lot of media coverage, and that sort of led the way to where we are now in terms of many of the conversations that we're having. There has also been a lot more media visibility and coverage around tragedies within the profession. Eilene obviously shared the story of Peter's tragic demise. You've probably seen some stories of other law firm tragedies that have made their way into the headlines in recent years. These tragedies are not new. I've been hearing about them since day one of becoming a clinician working specifically with the legal profession. But what is new is that these problems tend to make their way into the headlines in a way that they didn't earlier. I want you to recognize that with the increased visibility of these issues and the more open dialogue that we're having, it's not all bad news. We are increasingly seeing more success stories. Lawyers being willing to step forward and share their stories in a public forum. That's Steve Wally's the managing partner of Morgan Lewis, who decided almost 2 years ago at this point to share his recovery from alcoholism with me in a podcast interview for the American Lawyer that was subsequently picked up by other media outlets. But that's one example of a leader within the profession who, in recognition of the challenges we face, in recognition of the widespread stigma, decided to step forward and say, wait, there is hope. You can actually get help, get well, and continue to thrive in this profession. So it's not all bad news by any means. As the profession has been confronting the challenges that we face over the course of the last several years, there has been a search for answers. What do we do? What do we do to help those who are struggling now? But ultimately, and I would argue more importantly, what do we do to sort of go upstream and find out what's causing the problems? And I think this quote from Desmond Tutu really sort of sums up the level of introspection that is currently happening among many stakeholders within the profession today in 2020. There comes a point where we need to stop just pulling people out of the river. We need to go upstream and find out why they're falling in. So how is that happening here in the United States? Well, I would direct you to the report of the National Task Force on Lawyer Wellbeing, which was published about 3 years ago at this point, not quite 3 years ago. I'm a member of that task force, and what we did was set out to outline recommendations for all stakeholders within the profession, law schools, legal employers, the judiciary, regulators, etc., specific and concrete, tangible steps they could take to begin to initiate a culture change. Because if we're actually going to reduce the incidence and impact of mental health problems and addiction and a lack of well-being within the legal profession, what we actually need to do is to facilitate a culture change. And so we set out recommendations in this report, and we began by defining the concept of well-being. And I just want to familiarize you with this. If this is something you are interested in, personally, professionally, academically, when we talk about well-being in the legal profession, and when we talk about various initiatives aimed at supporting well-being, we're not speaking in a narrow sense about mental health and addiction. It is sort of a broader concept. that contemplates that there's a lot to us. We borrowed from the World Health Organization. We used their definition of human well-being, adapted it, modified it, made it a little bit more lawyer-specific. But it is a more holistic concept. Since that National Task Force report was published in 2017, 33 statewide task forces or commissions have been formed to begin to initiate change at the local, the statewide level. Why is that relevant? Well, I don't need to tell a room full of lawyers and law students that we are regulated at the state level, right? Ultimately, if there's going to be any teeth behind initiative changes or rule changes, et cetera, that has to happen at the statewide level, and it's happening. We have a significant number of states who are really embarking upon this journey. I had the opportunity on October 10th of last year, along with my colleagues at the ABA, to launch, I spearheaded this Anti-Stigma Campaign. We actually had a student from, a former Stanford law student, participate in this and share his story. And what we did is collect testimonials from 8 or 10 legal professionals, law students, a federal judge, practicing lawyers, who shared a little bit about their own struggles with either mental health, substance use disorders, or both. And we compiled a video, about 3.5 minutes long. It's perfect for sharing on sort of social media or otherwise electronically distributing. And it offers hope for people who might be struggling and might be wondering, should I get help? Is there a problem? Is there any option for me to get treatment and still remain in the profession? So I'm not going to play the video for you today. I could have, it's only 3.5 minutes, but I'm not going to, but I do want to direct your attention to that. It's housed on the ABA's website, the Anti-Stigma Campaign. I think the video is quite powerful and maybe a useful resource for you or your organization. The ABA Wellbeing Pledge. This is something that I've been intimately involved with since its inception. Actually, since before its inception, this was my idea. When I was back at Hazel and Betty Ford, I first proposed this idea about 5 years ago. At the time, it was met with a lot of skepticism and actually some laughter from the room full of lawyers that I was addressing when I suggested that we should get legal employers to take a pledge that they would do certain things to reduce the incidence of mental health problems in the profession. Fast forward to 2018, I had the opportunity to present the idea again, this time in partnership with the ABA, and it took hold. So since launching with 12 signatories about 1.5 years ago, we now have, as of this morning, I checked, that is the most current total, 176 signatories to this pledge framework. So the first thing that I want to say about the ABA Wellbeing Pledge, it's not a panacea. It's not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve the legal profession's significant challenges related to mental health and substance use disorders. But it is a significant start. It's a sign of progress. It's a roadmap for change, and it's a 7-step framework that legal employers commit themselves to, that they're going to do various things to support their people and to ultimately, hopefully, reduce the amount, sort of the frequency with which their people are struggling. So the fact that we now have up to 176 signatories, I think, is really good news. And it shows that we are making some headway, we are making some progress. The final thing that I want to note for you, and then we are going to open this up to a discussion, is that I'm launching a new research project in collaboration with the California Lawyers Association and the DC Bar. So that 2016 study was useful, and its findings were instructive, and in many ways that research was absolutely groundbreaking. The data is also 4 years old now, and we also need to move beyond prevalence data alone and to explore, from an empirical standpoint, the underlying causes, to really get at the why of the equation, right? Why are these challenges happening disproportionate to the general population and other professions? And so, for anyone in the room who may be a member of the California Lawyers Association, you may be seeing the survey in your inbox at the end of March, and it's also being distributed in DC. And it will be the first research project, at least here in the United States, to really explore the causal aspect of all of this. And we're using a lot of instruments that should hopefully tease out, in a useful sense, why lawyers are more predisposed to these issues than we know that they are. So I'm going to stop there, and then we're going to open it up to questions and conversation.
So I'm just going to ask a couple questions, and then we're going to open it up to all of you. The issue of wellness has come up in several center events since both of you were last year at Stanford. At one, which featured managing partners at leading law firms, all discussed the increased attention they were paying to the issue and some of their wellness programs. But as some of my students who attended the event noted, they didn't really talk about structural changes like oppressive billable hour norms and expectations of 24/7 availability that contribute to the problem for so many lawyers like Peter. So what do you think is going to push legal employers to address those underlying causes rather than just the symptoms? Start with you.
So I think it's a really interesting question, and it really is ultimately the most important question. How do we get at the underlying structural causes of the problems that are resulting in so many lawyers struggling? Embarking upon that analysis is something that many legal employers have to date been reluctant to do. Right? It is easier to put out the fires. It is easier to pull people out of the stream, out of the river, as the quote suggests, than to go upstream and really be honest and candid about why people are falling in. I do think the billable hour is implicated in that. I don't think it is the sole culprit. Right? I think what is equally responsible is the 24/7 expectation of availability and the fact that many people in the profession are not given adequate time to recharge. And they're not given adequate time to engage in other things, including nurturing their relationships and spending time with other human beings that might otherwise support them in their well-being and reduce their risk. I am optimistic that a younger generation of lawyers who are seeking a different experience will ultimately facilitate that change and at least force law firms to grapple with those issues in a more meaningful and head-on way. But that's not going to happen tomorrow. I think also that many legal employers are seeing an increase, and I didn't note this in my introduction to myself. What I do now, I currently work as an advisor primarily to large law firms and corporate legal departments in the realm of behavioral health. So I advise them on a range of issues, including when they have people struggling. And large organizations are seeing more people struggling, and sometimes in very acute ways. And so I think that is also going to force the conversation more out into the open. But not losing sight of the progress that's been made, we are at least now having this conversation openly and candidly, but we weren't 5 years ago. There wasn't even sort of the framework to get to that second step of the analysis.
I agree. We didn't even have the vocabulary.
We can have the vocabulary.
Right. So I will say, just to build on what Patrick said, I found this very interesting study when I was writing the book. It's called The Status Health Paradox, and it was published in March 2017. And it was a study of U.S. and Canadian lawyers, and what they found was that higher status lawyers had a mental health disadvantage relative to their peers in the public sector, and were no better off in terms of health than lawyers at firms that were like less high status, probably less high paying. Second, they wrote, the interplay between practice setting and income, it adds a level of complexity. And when you adjust for income, health disparities across practice settings become even greater. Were it not for higher incomes in larger firms, the health gap between the public sector and larger firms, public sector lawyers being healthier mentally and physically than big law lawyers, would be even larger. So large firm lawyers report a lower probability of good health and a higher probability of poor health relative to those in the public sector and those in solo practices and small firms. And I think things like that are what will force a change, because I think it's going to come from the top and the bottom. So younger generations of lawyers that are highly desired by big law and firms are, I'm hoping at least, that when they come in, they will demand certain things like, I'm not going to work both days of the weekend, or I'm going to take my paternity leave, or maternity leave, or maternity leave they kind of have to take. But also, and on the other, so that would be kind of the bottom up. At the top end would be firms saying, you know what, in our firm, everybody takes their vacation. You know, don't tell us you're not taking it, you don't get to carry it over, or, you know, they insist that, or it becomes part of the culture that when a man's wife has a baby, the man takes paternity leave, and instead of all the other lawyers snickering at him behind his back, which often happened in Peter's firm, you're encouraged to take it, and the culture really embraces that. So I do feel hopeful, because the younger lawyers I talk to, even though they are more susceptible to substance use disorders, they also, I think, would look at Peter and think, I don't want that. Like, I don't want to be that. I'd rather give up the equity partnership and actually not get divorced, or spend some time with my kids, or have a life outside of the firm, rather than have the money he has and the status he has, but, you know, no pictures of his kids in his office, that kind of thing.
Great. Well, to follow up a little bit on both of those comments, you in your book, I mean, you talk about work itself being an addiction for some people, especially lawyers. What does that mean? And maybe Petra can fill in how it relates to substance use addictions.
So when I did my reaching out to lawyers to find out what they were using, why they were using, what they were seeing around them, many of them wrote to me to say that basically this: the addiction is to work. That's where it starts. And I think it's like, it felt like it was a cascade. So you'd start just by like working really hard, working all the time, not turning off your phone, taking it to the bathroom, constantly checking it, having by the bed. And then it leads to a host of physical and psychic symptoms that make you feel either in pain just from sitting at a desk all day, or cramping your head, or being on the phone, right? Peter had terrible carpal tunnel and bursitis and all of that from the mouse. And then you're also feeling kind of depressed, or you're anxious because the clients think they can have access to you all the time. And then I think that's when you start medicating. Maybe you take some Xanax, or you find that you can get Adderall to keep yourself more productive. Maybe you're smoking cannabis at night, which, by the way, is 8 times stronger than it was in the 90s, and is a very powerful psychoactive drug now. And then before you know it, there's some leftover Percocet or Vicodin. And I think the addictions develop from that, but a lot of the attorneys I spoke with said the first addiction, the base addiction, was the addiction to work. That's how I saw it from them.
I think that's absolutely right, and I've seen it estimated, and we don't have great data on this, but I've seen it estimated that 1 in 4 practicing lawyers actually qualifies as a work addict, right? They're having a work addiction. The one thing that I did want to add, if I can pull this slide up, I don't know, is that gone, Jason? Just sort of in terms of the definition that we have for addiction. Thank you.
That's great, yeah.
So the American Society of Addiction Medicine is sort of the most well-regarded professional organization in the medical community dealing with specifically addiction. And I just want to show you their definition of addiction, their most current definition of addiction, adopted last year. It's a treatable chronic medical disease involving complex interactions among brain circuits, genetics, the environment, and an individual's life experiences. People with addiction use substances or engage in behaviors that become compulsive and often continue despite harmful consequences. And it's really those two components, the compulsive aspect and continuing despite harmful consequences. And that can be true whether someone is struggling with an addiction to alcohol, the heroin, the benzodiazepines, or whether it is a work addiction. The behavior becomes compulsive. It is sort of hardwired into them, and oftentimes they really don't know how to not do it. And they may continue that despite adverse and potentially harmful consequences. So there is really, right on its face, some overlap there. What I would say is that in both instances, whether it be a work addiction or a substance addiction, the person is looking to sort of sometimes a void within themselves, right? They're looking for external sort of relief and external fulfillment in pursuit of some sense, they're trying to fill a void within themselves. And so that's something that we have to be on guard about within the legal profession, because in many work environments, there is no shortage of work to do. And if you want to become addicted to your work, and if you want that to really dominate your life, that's going to be there for you. Just as there is no shortage of alcohol availability or substance availability, right? Those things are there, and if you're not sort of warned about excessive indulgence of those things, the risk is there as well.
You know what, I wanted to just add, I interviewed this guy, Judd Brewer, who has a really popular TED Talk, but he also has a book called The Craving Mind, and he's an addiction psychiatrist, and he said once he started studying addiction, He found it everywhere, and he said to me, continued tweeting despite adverse consequences, continued shopping, continued computer gaming, continued eating, daydreaming. Addiction really isn't limited to so-called hard drugs and addictive substances. He said it's everywhere.
Yes.
So I think, right,
Absolutely.
work included in that.
Great. All right, so last question. One of the statistics I found most alarming in the study you briefly mentioned about law students who also come into law school with normal sort of profiles in terms of mental health, but leave with a much higher incidence of problems than the general population, is that a third of them, when surveyed, said that if they saw a classmate struggling, they would do nothing. And I just found that kind of astonishing. So I guess the question that I'll put to you both, and then hope that some members of the audience can respond to as well. If you're a lawyer or a law student, and you want to be aware of and supportive of people who are struggling with these issues while not invading their privacy, what kinds of behaviors should you look out for, and what should you do that would be a constructive response?
Well, I can tell you what I often tell people to look for in lawyers, and I imagine it's the same thing, but it would be, and I'm looking right now, I think I know what it is, but some of the signs, for instance, that I missed were excessive sleepiness, someone that's kind of falling asleep or nodding off during a conversation, or when you're in a meeting or in like a study group. There was also a lot of, there was weight loss, there was also the opposite effect, kind of a jittery restlessness, a lot of absence and being late for things or constant excuses. I missed things like sores on Peter's hands and face. That comes from amphetamine use. He was losing his hair. I think if somebody doesn't look right or is acting in way or is behaving in ways that don't make sense, or their thinking seems less coherent than it was, and it seems to be accelerating. For me, I made excuses. I thought he was bipolar, had an eating disorder. You know, I interviewed a woman who thought her husband, who was a meth addict and a lawyer, had a brain tumor. Like, for me, these were signs of drug addiction, and I missed them. I think Patrick probably is.
I think that's all right. At a sort of high level, you want to be looking for changes in the person. That can be difficult if you don't know them, right? If you don't know the person, you're not familiar with what their normal is, and you don't have a good sort of baseline read on them, it can be difficult to detect when they're changing. But if you do know them, or at least you have some regular familiarity with them, I would say you want to look for changes in their mood or their attitude, right? Does their mood seem to be going up and down or otherwise deteriorating? Deterioration in their appearance, right? And sometimes it's very sensitive, and you don't want to be commenting on someone's appearance, but the reality is if they look unwell for a period of time and their appearance is continuing to decline, that might in fact be a huge red flag that something is wrong. And just the general sort of performance that they might be engaging in, right? What is their quality of work? If it's a work environment, what is their quality of performance, in terms of their studies, if it's at a law school environment. But you're looking for a change, a decline across areas like that. In terms of how you might approach the person, you don't have to be a coach, you don't have to be a therapist, you don't have to be a trained interventionist to just have a sort of care and concern conversation with someone, to just be a human being, right? Check in with them. And that's something that we don't really spend a lot of time talking to law students or lawyers about, right? Our humanity. And just be a human being. Look out for other people. We in fact encourage people to be ultra competitive and maybe not to look out for your colleagues, because if they're falling down, guess what? That's more room for you to move ahead. And so, you don't have to be a trained professional to be able to have a conversation. Just check in with someone, right? What's going on with you? You don't seem like yourself. And you might want to be able to cite some of the specific things that you've observed about them and what those changes are.
Great. All right, questions from all of you? Yes?
Hello, Fritz Lebowski. I'm from France. I'm starting in consulting business in the area from technology to people caring, well-being. So I get more and more in touch in the technical world, like also in Stanford, that we try to figure out how we can structurally connect with ethical foundations that are much more powerful, and we try to figure out how to make sense between the ethical human being foundations from the very beginning, from kindergarten, that people have projects where they connect in social intelligence efforts. And so, what are the things that you discover once we are lagging behind? How can we just trigger things before we have to see the symptoms that are disrupting? So, what is the framework that you can build early on to lower the stress and use social context, as you just said it, where a human being works like a person and not like an object?
I mean, the legal profession is a very competitive profession at the top, and I think you're right. I don't think, I was speaking to somebody that actually that's founded the law firm that Peter was at, and she was saying that in the old days, he set it up so that lawyers would be in small teams, he would generate competition between them to kind of get that going, so they could make more money and build. But, what we really need is for people to feel from early on like they're part of a team. I think you're right, so that they can look out for each other and there's a sense of community. One of the women I talked to that's a senior partner in a firm said when she was younger, maybe it was the women, but they would look out for each other. So if one was out sick, the other one wasn't trying to capitalize on the other's misfortune, they would cover for the other person. But I think we're talking about a profession that isn't originally structured that way. So I think a lot has to change.
I think it also, to some extent it starts in legal education as well, because, we pride ourselves in teaching students to think like a lawyer, by which we mean, analytic achievement. And we don't emphasize the soft skills. We relegate those to clinics. And people think, well, that's touchy-feely, emotional intelligence quotient, which we know is a much higher predictor of success, even in our cognitive profession, than just intellectual ability. And I think for so many lawyers, the soft stuff is the hard stuff. And we really need to start much earlier in legal education to build that understanding, to nurture those skills, those connections with other people, thinking about relationships and mentoring and teamwork. All of that needs, I think, a much more prominent place.
I agree with that fully, Deborah. And both of you, I think, used the word connection, and that is so vitally important. Lawyers are the loneliest professionals, at least according to a study that was published a couple of years ago. We score the highest on the loneliness scales. And I think that's because there's so much opportunity for isolation, and there's so much opportunity to really not be able to share your feelings with colleagues. That's not exactly incentivized within the legal profession. And we need to work on that. We need to look for ways to foster that social connection, because it's a protective factor for people's psychological health and well-being.
Yes. You
actually raised some of what I wanted to ask about, which is, I think a lot of this starts in law school. I mean, I went to law school more than 30 years ago, and it sounds like not that much has changed, in that it starts out very competitive and very aggressive, and the professors were really working to get you to be competitive and threatening that you were, half this class would fail, and it did. People were forced out of law school really early on, and so it feeds a very competitive process. And I'm wondering, it sounds like a lot of what ends up in the firms is incubated in the law schools, and is there any focus on trying to address that more at the core, so that you're graduating lawyers who might not become the people who are forming those kinds of firms?
Well, as someone who probably graduated from law school at the same time you did, I'm happy to report that, the pedagogy has changed a lot since then. There is not that sort of harsh, humiliating, kind of Socratic, guess what I'm thinking on the part of the professor. Everybody, somehow is found wanting. I remember somebody saying that, taking a class with him, like, I've never heard an encouraging word in the sky, and the issues remain cloudy all day. That was pretty much my law school experience. And I was horrified to learn when I went into teaching, and my very first year of teaching, all I had as a backdrop were my own notes from contracts, and when I went back to look at them, it's just one question after another. There were no answers anywhere in the notes. So I think we moved somewhat away from that, but here's what hasn't changed. Although the classroom atmosphere is much friendlier, and we don't cold call, we have sort of warm, fuzzy calls with panels and, nudging people into participation. We still have mandatory curves. We're still grading people not on the basis of their performance, but how well they do in comparison with the next person, and that inevitably fosters a sense of competition. And for a lot of students at schools like Stanford who rarely got a B in their life before, suddenly they're competing against everybody else with those kinds of records. And by definition, if you're on a curve where only 40% of the students can get honors, most of the students in your class are going to really feel disappointed. And that, that contributes to serious mental health issues, no question about it. And I don't know how to fix that. Grading reform is one of those, third rails of faculty politics nobody wants to ever touch. And we made the system a little flatter and less harsh, but so we don't, it's not A minus, B plus, B minus, but because we removed those gradients, everybody clusters in the middle, and we're drawing, not very meaningful distinctions between the students who get honors and the students who get passes, and students experience that. I think really negatively in many cases.
One sign of progress that I would note in the sort of national law school community, there's a paper that's going to be published this year in the Journal of Legal Education by a woman at Fordham, Jordana Campino, I think, who authored it. Anyhow, it was a survey of American law schools and what they're currently doing around mental health, emotional well-being generally. Half of law schools reported that they are now deploying resources and making additional resources available, offering courses, other sort of trainings for their law students in the realm of well-being. That is a significant increase from 5 years ago or 10 years ago, when many schools weren't doing anything in this space. Now, you could make the case that that's more sort of addressing symptoms than rather getting at cause, but at least it's still some progress.
Yeah, well, I think there is, and we're doing much more. We now have much more programming on this. We have a voluntary anxiety training class, and people in this room, they have taken it, but only a third of the students sign up for it, and it's probably not the third of the students that would most benefit from it. So, I'm all ears for what else legal education can do. There's some long waiting lists at our counseling service that the law school circumvented by making additional counselors available, but I don't know if we're doing enough here to address the root causes. Yeah.
That kind of dovetails into my question. I suspect that if you had noticed, or if you had addressed the issues with your ex-husband, he probably would have had great answers that would have deflected your concerns, and he would have left them unaddressed. And so isn't the real thing about addiction like teaching people how to be self-aware enough so that they realize the problem in themselves? Because usually everybody can recognize it about someone else, but it's very difficult to recognize it about yourself.
Yeah, there's like an old, this is not a flattering thing, but they're like, how do you know if an addict is lying? Their lips are moving. So, but yeah, he was like a champion liar. And you're probably right. He would have said something, and I was getting close, but I didn't get there. But asking for self-awareness is a beautiful thing, but I think as anybody who gets to be in their 50s as I am, it takes, he was not self-aware. That was the last thing he wanted to do, and a lot of his colleagues that I knew that were men were like that. It was like, I'm not going there. Like with everything, even in my book, I say he barely showed up for marriage counseling. Like I'd get to the office and he'd call and say, I can't, I have a meeting. So I'd be like, well, let's talk about my mother then. We can always talk about her, but he didn't want to go there. In fact, one time in counseling, our therapist said, so Peter, how do you feel about that? And I'll never forget, he said, I don't know how I feel. And he said, I don't think it matters. And I think that also is what made him such a good lawyer. He was very unemotional, he was really good at what he did, but you're right, without that self-awareness, and I think at that level, there's also a certain level of arrogance. Like I think he probably thought, like, I can manage this. I can recreationally use, and look at all I'm doing. I'm doing all this stuff at the firm. I'm still managing my life, even though he wasn't. So I think you raised a really good point. It's a really hard thing to get someone else to acknowledge that there's this problem, especially with that personality. But yeah, good point.
Yeah, and I would add to that the power of denial that people experience can be quite profound. Lawyers specifically have a lot of tools at their disposal to convince themselves and others that there really isn't a problem. And sometimes, though, there's also a lot of fear that surrounds the idea of making a change. I've counseled a lot of lawyers and judges and law students who knew that there was a problem. They knew that they had an active addiction, and they knew that that was real, and that it was possibly going to end their life if not addressed. But the fear of making a change, right? Because that is how they were able to get through the day. That was how they were able to get where they were in terms of their life and their career. Using that drug had been a means to an end that, or frequently it was alcohol, and people couldn't imagine going back to their life and not drinking, right? So there's a lot of fear, there's a lot of denial. Both of those things can be overcome, right? If someone is working with a skilled, trained therapist, they can help them confront those problems and work through them and ultimately see the light. The one thing that I would like to offer is sort of on point here is that someone doesn't have to hit what we would call rock bottom, right? I view that as a rather unhelpful construct, that people, they don't have to get to the end of the road. Your bottom is when you stop digging, right? And it's when you're able to maybe make some changes.
So kind of piggybacking on what you just said and connecting a few things that you talked about, you said that if you had asked if he was okay, he probably would have said no. And I think I remember from your article he was still doing fairly good work. And to use your theme of pulling people out of the river, if you have somebody that is not really wanting to seek help and wanting to continue down this path, how can we as a profession really encourage that? I mean, from your diagram of the firm, these are all changes that are pretty broad, but not that concrete. If somebody's actually struggling, if we actually are the 2/3 of people who ask, can we make a difference? How do we actually create that change and push that person to get help, to get to a better place?
I just want to say, actually, Peter wasn't doing good work. He had stopped showing up largely. It's just that and this is part of your question, is I think nobody wanted to address it. So it would have been great if someone said, like, listen, you've got two choices. Either you're going to be dismissed or you're going to go to treatment, because I can see this is happening, but no one went near it. Yeah.
And I noticed that wasn't in your diagram for the pleasure firms, something of that sort.
To sort of compel people to seek help. Sometimes you can't in the absence of some sort of problem that they are causing, or some sort of clear defect in the work that they're producing. Firms might not feel comfortable, employers might not feel comfortable intervening. It's also thorny because it may be a medical issue, right? I mean, we are potentially talking about diseases, and lawyers are very risk averse, law firms are very risk averse, and so sometimes it may be a rationalization, but that's the reason why they won't intervene on the problem, because they don't want to get involved in a medical issue.
I was struck earlier by your comment. You said that there's lawyers feel they won't discuss this openly or even put it on surveys for the fear that there'll be a license problem. And I'm wondering, in the medical profession, there are some, I believe my wife's a physician, in the medical profession, you can anonymously, a colleague can anonymously discuss another colleague with the medical board and say, I think this person needs help. I believe, I'm not sure, again, I'm just getting this firsthand. I was wondering, first of all, is that possible with the bar Secondly, is it possible that you could get the California Supreme Court, when they're looking at attorney licensing issues, to basically put a waiver in place and say when somebody does this, it's not going to be part of the record. You won't be, you won't be considered on it. There won't, and in case of any disbarments or disciplinary functions, that part of the record is sealed. And the question is, would that be something which would be helpful? And maybe when you're doing your survey, California and DC, maybe you might want to consider asking a question: if this were the case, would you be more likely to come forward or have a friend, or try to get help for a friend?
Well, most bars do have diversion programs.
Not
that are not-
licensing issues.
What?
Yeah, but, yeah, okay, I'm sorry.
Well, no, go ahead. But I'm just saying, you can report someone and have them get into a treatment program that will remain confidential and it won't jeopardize their license.
Yeah.
And I think most lawyers know that that's available. I think most of them know. There are a lot of peer-to-peer groups now. I'm blocking, you would know the names, that take recovering alcoholics, for example, who will assist other struggling lawyers, and it all remains confidential. Yeah, the other bar.
Right. In California, there's the Lawyer Assistance Program. Most states have a version of the Lawyer's Assistance Program, which does provide a mechanism by which you can reach out and report someone, or at least get feedback on someone about whom you may be concerned. Even with that guarantee of confidentiality, however, most lawyers are fearful of engaging that process.
Yeah.
And they also don't want to do that to colleagues oftentimes, right? They don't understand that they might actually be helping the person, and the culture that they've grown up in is one that you don't do that, right? You don't report a colleague struggling. I think frequently we gloss over or minimize our ethical obligations around all of these issues. Mental health, substance use, and someone's cognitive status. We're just not, we're not focused on those the way that the medical profession, for example, is, in my observation.
And in the medical profession, you could say, like, this doctor is reporting another doctor because lives are at stake, not just that doctor's lives, but the lives he or she touches. In law, likely you may screw up a matter or something, but your life is the one that's in danger probably. I mean, other lives, maybe your family members, maybe you're driving them, right? But so I think there's this perception that you want to get the doctor help, but the lawyer, I could see, lawyers are you're right, a peer would never have done it. He would have not believed in its confidentiality and not wanted to do that to a colleague.
Yes.
In your research, did you find any substantial differences in the rate of addiction for folks that worked at large brand name, big practices versus small independent practices or in-house counsel, or anything in different kinds of practices, litigation versus criminal law, a little bit more detail on the addiction
So
issues?
mine wasn't as comprehensive in the legal profession. I sort of asked for people to talk to me about what they were seeing wherever they are in terms of their own use and substance use. So mine is more anecdotal than someone like Patrick's. But what I found was that, and I also did a story for the Times about 10 years ago, which dovetails into this, is a lot of lawyers in big law, so that's the American Lawyer ranks the top 100 firms. So the AmLaw 100 were leaving and starting like boutique firms where they didn't go on a billable hours model, they did project-based pricing, and they were so much happier. And I will say, at the time, I had said to Peter, after the story publishes, why don't you connect with one of these firms? And there were a lot of them were intellectual property attorneys, it just happened to be. So I knew that that was happening. But I would say, by and large, the attorneys that came forward with substance use disorders and with anxiety and depression were from big law. It was, some were, very few were from the public sector, and very few were from small firms. Some were, but I did find that the ones that were in small firms, there was usually a partner that was just a really big jerk, like just throwing stuff at them, yelling. Usually one guy, his managing partner was a raging alcoholic, right? So like you have the vodka at the desk, and the whole thing. So it seemed that the bigger problem was the bigger firm, just like the studies bear out. These really large organizations, I heard from people from Latham, Skadden, Piper, a whole bunch of firms, Sidley, and I can even tell you, just like we think it's getting better, but just in the last year, if you look at where things that were happening,
In April 2019, you had 6 female lawyers suing Jones Day for discrimination stuff and a fraternity culture. In August, a Deckard associate in March 2019 died of a drug overdose. Baker McKenzie's global chairman, Paul Wallinson, he died at 56, after taking a temporary leave to deal with health issues caused by exhaustion. You have Sidley Austin partner Gabe McConnell, who's I interviewed his widow. He shot himself in the head in Sidley Austin's parking lot in LA in October 2018. And on July 3rd, last year, 2019, Matthew Benedict, a 26-year-old law student at the University of Buffalo School of Law, jumped off the roof of the building of the law firm where he was a summer associate. And he was very good. So, I mean, I think a lot of those were big law firms where that happened. It wasn't small ones.
Well, that's something that I'm hoping to explore in the new research with the California and DC lawyers to really tease that out. I can say that in the 2016 study, the levels of problematic alcohol use and depression and anxiety were relatively stable. I mean, there was a point or two difference between, whether someone was a rural lawyer, whether they were practicing in Colorado, or whether they were practicing in Manhattan, and firm size. So we were surprised by that. There weren't these wide sort of swings in terms of the prevalence. We still don't have enough data to say, I think, definitively that X work environment is the worst work environment in terms of the prevalence. I just don't know. But I do know that many lawyers working in large law firms leave those environments due to what they perceive as risk factors for depression, anxiety, stress, substance use. They burn out. They leave those environments, and they are able to find a career in other settings, whether that be in the law or elsewhere, that doesn't present those same challenges.
I think it's also important, though, to not think of this as just a big firm problem. I'm married to a public interest lawyer and have worked with public interest lawyers a lot in pro bono work, and many of them are really driven because they care passionately about the work, and they suffer burnout and all sorts of problems dealing, with clients who are in terrible circumstances, and they feel very helpless. They're putting Band-Aids on these huge gaping social wounds, and if they don't develop some coping mechanisms for that. I worked one summer for a public defender in Washington, and I was just there for a summer, but God, I was angry all the time. Life situations of our clients, and I was empathetic with the victims, and and my mother, who was a social worker, said, unless you can develop strategies for getting more distance on this, this is not the right fit for you. And she was right. I was not good. And I worked in law school doing direct service work for poor people, and it wasn't a good fit for me. I needed, one step removed because I just couldn't manage that distance. So I don't think, it's driven by other things. It's not the almighty dollar for people in the public sector, but if Ron Tyler, who was here earlier, were here now, he would tell you that public defenders have a lot of burnout and stress-related issues because of the nature of their work.
Hi, I coach lawyers now. I left 27 years of practicing law, and I'm coaching lawyers now. One of the things that has intrigued me is, and I read about it in, I don't know if you know Robert Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
Yeah.
So I read that book too, and he really captured something that I think is at the essence of this. It's that one of the most toxic combinations for humans in the workplace is this high expectation, high output, and low agency.
Yes.
And I would have to say, I don't have a huge bevy of clients to draw from. I can do a research project, but if there's one thing they all have in common is this profound sense of no agency. They can't control their time, they can't control their clients, everybody wants something, they can't deliver. And I'm just wondering if either the research or if that's been was part of your husband's story?
Well, I can tell you the research that I did for the book, that is like one of the #1 things about it for associates is a lack of autonomy, because they are so controlled by the clients and the partners they work for. And that lack of agency, yes, he was very depressed about that because you feel like you have no, and now because of technology, you have no control over any of your life. You're trying to go to your kid's soccer game and your boss is on the phone saying, where's the brief? You got to, you know, like, I think I wrote it in the New York Times piece. I mean, I remember Peter was a second-year associate and his boss called from a ski lift in Aspen. You know, and he was like, you better get that brief done, you know.
Well, and when I went
His
in-house,
first
it
wife.
was the same. It was no different in-house. I mean, you know,
Oh, same thing.
when the executive staff has a meltdown, they have a meltdown, whether it's Sunday night at 10 or.
Well, and I also think that lack of autonomy isn't gonna get better. If you're gonna charge a client $600 an hour, if I was paying them, I expect you to be at my beck and call. And so, I mean, but how do you ask the profession, why don't you make less? You know, why don't you just charge less per, I mean, it would be such a beautiful thing because there's plenty to go around, but I cannot imagine how it's gonna happen.
I'll build more redundancy into the work team so that people can cover.
So that people can cover.
That's the strategy, it just.
Such a good question.
Yeah, it just diminishes profits and, you know, money may not be at the root of all these evils, but it's responsible. Greed's responsible for part of them. Patrick, and then we're gonna.
I think it's a really important point. Martin Seligman in his work in positive psychology has talked about the lawyer's dilemma as well. And a piece of that really is the lack of control. These are solvable problems. Those are not things that are beyond our grasp if we wanted to actually really try and problem solve it. But we haven't, and not in meaningful ways, right? We were talking about building some redundancy into the system, just taking a project management approach to a lot of these things, including the expectation of our availability. Obviously, that costs money, and so that will diminish profits when you have to really do things like that. But nonetheless, these are solvable problems. I don't think we are ultimately resigned to not be able to do anything about this.
Yeah.
Final thought from either of you before we wind up?
I will be outside signing books. If anybody would like a book, I'd be happy to
Yeah.
meet you and sign it.
I would just say thank you.
And thank you, Deborah, for having us. And thank you guys for being